We're not throwing money. We haven't been throwing money at anything for the last few years. That's been the problem.
We've been throwing $50 billion of extra money at everything over the past 3 years.
Let's just play what's in front of us, and as things change and as policy announcements get made, we can factor those things in.
Nicola Willis has been talking about new revenue measures as a way of balancing the budget, but she doesn't seem to have told anybody what those new revenue measures might be.
It's been flying under the radar politically, which is surprising to me given how much money there is and how politicians act around pots of money. In 2011, there was a bit of a fuss about, it came to light that they'd invested in 15 companies involved in the production of nuclear weapons.
It looked closely at the concept of, well, is this a penalty? Is it a penalty clause, or is it actually a genuine compensation, if you like, for the employer to be compensated for the loss they've suffered as a result of an employee not giving the right amount of notice?
Welcome to the Weekly Wrap, where we go over the top video stories from the past week. First up, while 15 economists wrote to Prime Minister Christopher Luxon last week, urging him to end the government's spending cuts, not every economist agrees. Our political editor, Brent Edwards, sat down with economist Dr. Ganesh Nana and the New Zealand Initiative's Dr. Eric Crampton for a very fiery discussion.
Last week, a group of economists wrote to Prime Minister Christopher Luxon, urging him to put an end to government spending cuts. To talk about that, I'm joined by one of those economists, Dr. Ganesh Nana, and New Zealand Initiative Chief Economist, Dr. Eric Crampton. Well, let's start with you, Ganesh. Your concern is you say the spending cuts is driving the economy deeper into recession?
That's one of the points, but I think the more important point that we made was that the spending cuts and the drive for even lower government debt, we couldn't see the link between that and a better economy, and in particular the link between lower government debt and lower external debt, which is the more important debt that's constraining the New Zealand economy over the longer term. And it's one of those debts that we conflate with each other, those two debts, but those two debts are significantly different. And our external debt has been a problem for a long time, and we need to see a bit of a coherent government policy, whether it be spending cuts or whether it be tax increases or whether it be infrastructure spending, but something that's clearly linked to our ability to earn export dollars that will actually tackle that external deficit.
Eric, is that a fair point? What do you...
Well, not so much. The point of prudential debt levels has been that the government recognizes we're subject to weird shocks in a small country. So the letter from Nana and his colleagues was saying, oh, there's no debt crisis and our debt levels are low in international comparison. The point has always been here that Treasury and most others see the need for maintaining headroom. So if the Alpine Fault opened up at the same time as we were in a recession or at the same time as a hoof and mouth outbreak, the Crown needs to maintain the ability to borrow an awful lot of money in a big hurry and not on extremely punitive terms. So that's been the point of maintaining debt to GDP ratios around 30%. Getting back to those levels remains sensible. And really we're in the spot we're in now because of a lack of restraint in 2021 and 2022 when fiscal policy was making things worse for monetary policy. Currently, the Reserve Bank is easing, and they knew what national and the coalition government's policies were when they came in. So they have had a year to set policy with the government's intended fiscal track in mind. The Reserve Bank moves last. If there are problems in overall policy being too tight, well, that's for the Reserve Bank to be dealing with now as part of its correction of prior errors.
But one of the things actually that, the Treasury's come out with a speech this last week was sort of saying, well, actually one of the things is the economy is actually not growing as fast as we thought. That means tax revenue is going to go down. But so isn't, that making the situation worse even from that perspective?
Well, they pointed out that we have a structural deficit. So a cyclical deficit is one thing. Government will spend more when you're in a recession. Benefit payments always go up. Tax revenues go down in a recession. That's just automatic, and that's part of the cyclical deficit. The structural deficit is what we're in now. It's what we were in even during the COVID boom, right? Government is substantially spending more than it takes in revenue. You would have to increase taxes or reduce spending or look to asset sales to try and find some way of balancing these. The structural bit needs to be dealt with.
You're shaking your head.
I'm laughing. We focus on that structural deficit deficit, but you're being very imprecise in the wording. It's always focusing on the financials. It's always focusing on the government's financials. Going back to the original point about we need to, and this was Grant Robertson's great play, which is we need the rainy day surplus to put money aside for the rainy day. But that's just the financial monies. Where's the economic resilience that we're trying to build for those external shocks that we've always been subject to? We're always thinking about a financial reserve. Where's the economic reserve in terms of the investment in our people, up-to-date infrastructure, up-to-date health services, up-to-date workforce development and training and skills training? All of those things take time. The financial reserves is only one element, and if a financial reserve is being built up at the risk or actually at the cost of severely downgraded infrastructure, severely downgraded services, one would argue, what's the point? Okay, you've got this pile of stash of cash that you're going to hang on to when there's a crisis. But then when there's a crisis, the economy is in no fit position. The economy in the context of our infrastructure, our economic activity, our people are in no fit state to address that. So it's all financials. When are we going to talk about the economic structural deficit? And I agree, there is a huge structural deficit. It's got nothing to do with COVID. It's not nothing to do with the 5 years. We'd have a structural deficit in New Zealand for probably the last 50 years, if not longer, in terms of that imbalance between exports and imports and that imbalance in external debt. That's the true critical structural deficit that we ignore. And that's why I laugh at this idea that there's a structural deficit and cyclical deficit. Again, it's only the fiscals. When is the government going to stop looking after only itself, the government, and start having a look at the nation, not just the national economy for today, but for tomorrow and the next generation and beyond? That requires something much broader than Reserve Bank Act looking after inflation, much broader than a clinical focus on deficits in government debt, and a much more strategic view of how we're going to build infrastructure that will build that resilient economy, that will address that structural deficit, and that will address our ability to address the next shock when it hits us.
I mean, we do have an infrastructure deficit, don't we, Eric?
Well, it's kind of fun looking at that one. So from your column and from the open letter, you're pointing to the Infrastructure Commission's tallying of the 100 billion plus in infrastructure deficit. They weren't putting that up as a number that has to be filled. They were putting that up as a warning sign of our terrible practices in procurement and our inefficient construction productivity, because government keeps deciding what it wants to do, then rescoping it, and we wind up paying through the roof. When they'd looked at the numbers, we were paying about the same amount as a fraction of GDP as other high-income countries. The problem is that we're getting not very much for it. So there's one extent to which I'll agree with you, Ganesh, where I wouldn't see infrastructure debt properly viewed as being part of government main balance sheet debts where we're appropriately backed by revenue that comes from the supported projects. So if you're doing this properly, where a project had to pay its own way on the back of payments by its users or the beneficiaries of it over time, that should not be counted towards the government's debt to GDP ratio, because it's not something that would be constraining the government's ability to borrow in a crisis. At the same time, that would help in getting towards value for money in public sector spend on infrastructure, because nobody is going to lend you money for a road of national significance with a benefit cost ratio of less than 1 if the thing has to be able to pay itself off with payments from its users. It would help to constrain against dumb forms of spend that have low value, which is part of our overall productivity problem.
Again, we're focusing on the financials.
Well, what else is there? Like, the infrastructure program is not going to pay itself off if it's badly spec'd, and if we just keep throwing money at it.
We're not throwing money. We haven't been throwing money at anything for the last few years. That's been the problem.
We've been throwing $50 billion of extra money at everything over the past 3 years. We went from government spending of 28.8% of GDP.
28.8, it's hardly a number. Let's get that clear.
That was what the forecast was in the Great Wellbeing Budget that you guys figured was going to solve every problem in the world.
Not you guys. I was never responsible for the Wellbeing Budget, and don't take that back, please. You guys.
The left, broadly construed, loved the well-being budget and was broadly
you're putting
supportive.
me in the left. Stop using labels.
okay, whatever label you like, but it went from 28.8% of GDP as being the forecast to 34.5% in 2022, okay? Some of that was necessary for COVID, but we have locked in a substantial ratchet increase in government spending, and the letter is recommending that we maintain that. So we maintain... Real per capita government expenditure was between $2,200 and $2,400 for like a good decade, 2009 through 2018. It peaked at about $2,900, is back to around 26. This is a ratchet increase if we're saying that it can't go below that.
Where would you invest, Ganesh?
Where would I invest? In the people. We've got severely hurting people. We've got a workforce that hasn't been invested in, and so there's no... I suppose no opportunity for us to live that productivity if we're serious over the next 25, 30, 40 years. What's the time horizon? Investing in today is hopeless. Again, where is the government that's providing us with that strategic vision for the strategic future, which is investing in the next 30 to 50 years rather than the last 3 to 5 years?
Would that largely be through borrowing, or would you be looking at tax increases, capital gains tax, new taxes to broaden the tax base?
Well, I think that's the argument that I'm sure I'll differ with Eric on this one, but the level of government spending, if you like, or dare I say government involvement in the economy is a lot higher, needs to be a lot higher than it currently is, because demands on government or publicly provided services, whether they be education or health, whether they be workforce, whether they be health, I've just said health, education, workforce, are those critical things, let alone infrastructure, let alone research and development, science, innovation, all of those things. The demands for publicly, I won't say government, but for publicly provided services are a lot higher than they used to be. The metrics of past years, and somehow we've got to hold government to previous years' levels, is a misnomer. It's missing the question. The critical question is that our demographics and our economy has changed considerably and will continue to change. And is the government ready to make appropriate changes for those changes into the future, rather than always looking in the rear vision mirror?
And you can read and watch more at mbr.co.nz. The Reserve Bank is comfortable that inflation is under control and has never been clearer about its next official cash rate move. This week, the central bank cut the OCR by another 50 basis points to 4.25%, as widely expected. Stick around as we speak with BNZ Chief Economist Mike Jones about the cut and what's just around the corner. The Reserve Bank has cut the official cash rate by 50 basis points. With us is BNZ Chief Economist Mike Jones. So, Mike, what are your thoughts on Adrian Orr's language?
Well, look, the statement wasn't too far from our expectations. We thought the bank played things with a pretty straight bat. We got the 50-point cut. That was widely expected. We got an intention to keep cutting next year, and we got the bank carving itself off a bit of flexibility to respond to things over the next 12 weeks. So all of that pretty much in line with expectations. But yeah, we did see Adrian Orr in the press conference signal with perhaps a bit more intent about an intention to keep front-loading policy rate cuts with a 50-point signal for February.
What reaction was there to that?
Well, the financial markets were flipped around a little bit. I mean, I think if you looked at some of the numbers in the statement, it was perhaps more in keeping with a sort of 50-50 type chance, 25 versus 50 in February. The language in the press conference was a little bit more equivocal, so we saw market pricing turn around in the sort of minutes after some of that commentary came through. But look, overall, the market reaction hasn't been huge and is actually consistent with some of the easing the market had in there for next year being priced out a little bit.
What are some of the near-term, medium-term risks?
Well, there's lots. I mean, I think if you think about the 12 weeks between now and the Reserve Bank's next missive, you know, we've got the big three in New Zealand. We've got inflation, we've got GDP, we've got unemployment. We've also got, of course, offshore, the run-in to the new president's inauguration at the end of January. And so all of those things can throw up some surprises. And so, you know, we did see the Reserve Bank, I guess, reflect that in their commentary by carving off some flexibility to respond to any changes they do get.
Adrian also talked about trade, geopolitical risks.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, those things are front of mind for everyone at the moment. Look, from where we and the Reserve Bank and others are sitting at the moment, it's pretty hard to be definitive about how all of that lands. So it's a matter of, I guess, watching and waiting. It's a similar approach, I think, to what we've seen other central banks around the world do as well, particularly the US Federal Reserve, which is, look, let's just play what's in front of us, and as things change and as policy announcements get made, we can factor those things in.
The forward track appears to be inflation hovering in that 2 range.
Yeah, inflation's pretty well contained, not only in the numbers, but also in the Reserve Bank's commentary. Look, we concur. I think inflation is down and will stay down around that 2% mark, and that obviously affords the bank the flexibility to respond in the way that it's doing, which is to front load the easing that the economy needs. So yeah, we don't think in the short term inflation's about to break higher again, and as a result interest rates can continue to be lowered.
So this was the final decision for the year. Let's backtrack. In hindsight, should the cuts have come earlier?
Well, look, we were saying earlier in the year that there was a case to possibly lower the official cash rate earlier, and so look, that's there. I think from the Reserve Bank's perspective, the quid pro quo was always that once inflation was brought to heel and brought under control, that they could respond aggressively, and that's what we've seen. I mean, the OCR is 125 points lower than where it was in August, and to our minds that's been the right approach, and as we move forward into next year and probably the middle and latter stages of next year, we'll probably see a bit more of a feel as you go type approach and a reversion to the more normal sort of 25 point cut per meeting moves.
Do you think they were a little surprised about how fast inflation retreated?
Yeah, possibly on inflation. I think the biggest surprise, not just for the bank, but for many, was just how quickly and aggressively economic activity created through the middle part of this year. I mean, we were seeing it in the numbers, but also it was very clear from talking to businesses that the economy really hit a wall at that time. It was already weak, but it hit a wall in the middle of the year. That no doubt helped bring inflation lower as well. And what we're seeing from the numbers now is, not just that inflation is contained, but actually there's some risk it goes, maybe a little bit below 2% through the second half of next year. But a lot of sort of geopolitical, trade and global risks to address before we get into that sort of territory.
Tax policy was top of mind as the Labour Party headed into its annual conference this weekend. We sat down with Labour Party leader Chris Hipkins to talk about the party's next steps.
The Labour Party holds its annual conference this weekend, and tax policy looks likely to dominate much of the debate. To talk about that, I'm joined by Labour leader Chris Hipkins. Well, to be fair, it's more broader fiscal and economic policy that you'd put it into that.
Absolutely. I don't think you can consider tax policy in isolation. I think there are issues around the fairness of our tax system that more and more people are now seeing and more commentators are commenting on. So, the government overall gets about 70% of its tax revenue through personal income tax. That puts us right at the top end of the OECD in terms of, of that, whereas most other OECD countries have a more diversified tax system. But you can't talk about solutions to that problem without talking about where you see the economy going, where you see government spending going, what your priorities are. All of those things are connected to one another.
And I mean, obviously, you've got the Treasury, obviously we have the IMF, OECD have talked about the need for a more comprehensive capital gains tax. I think for a while there was talk about tax switch, but I think too now, looking ahead to an ageing population, the pressure on health and that, whether there just is talk about broadening the tax base to actually take in more tax?
Well, see, I think there's still a lot of water to flow under the bridge between now and the next election. Nicola Willis has been talking about new revenue measures as a way of balancing the budget, but she doesn't seem to have told anybody what those new revenue measures might be. That's new revenue could be new taxes. It could be new fees, levies. There's all sorts of things that she could be contemplating in that space. Till we know what that is, I think it's very hard for us to nail down exactly what we would do, because it may well be that, if she comes up with new revenue measures that we agree with, we'd want to keep those.
We had that group of economists write to the Prime Minister last week expressing concern about the government's fiscal policy and essentially saying government spending cuts were just making the recession worse and it wasn't addressing the broader economic issues the country faced. Did you generally agree with the...
I did generally agree with it. I think the main thrust of their argument, which seems to be lost on this government, is that there is a relationship between economic growth and whether the government's fiscal policy is expansionary or contractionary. They have a contractionary fiscal policy and at a time when the economy is also contracting, and so they're making that worse. So I think the economist's point was a really well-made one, that government scaling back its investment in things like school buildings, new hospital builds, even transport projects where they've scaled back the spending on those areas, building new state houses. Government cutting back spending in those areas has actually hurt the economy. So there's a relationship between government debt, government surplus and economic growth. And if the government is ultimately slowing economic growth through its actions, then it's making the deficit and the debt problems for the government worse.
But is it just a question of how much though? Because, in your last year, Grant Robertson was looking at 1 to 2% sort of cuts in government spending across departments. Do you accept that the argument that there needs to be fiscal control and better fiscal management?
Of course, government needs to be disciplined in its budgeting. Government needs to be disciplined in getting value for money for every dollar that it spends on behalf of New Zealanders. So yes, of course, we should always be looking at areas where we can make savings and where we can redirect funding. We should always be very conscientious about that, recognising that it's public money that we are spending on behalf of all New Zealanders. But what this government are doing is cutting without any regard for the flow-on consequences of that. We're seeing a health system that's sort of really under a lot of pressure, and the government not making the investments that are required to give us the sort of healthcare that New Zealanders want to see in the future. But they're also making some silly decisions. So they're reducing funding on preventative healthcare, when actually that's exactly what we should be focused on. If you want fewer people in emergency departments, if you want fewer people needing elective surgeries, focus on keeping people healthier in the first place.
What do you hope will come out of the conference? I mean, I know it's not going to come up with detailed policy, but is the sense that from the various remits and what comes out of the conference that will give some direction to your policy council and MPs about the sort of policy that the party as a whole wants to see?
I think it's still very early days yet. There'll be a debate about tax remits. I fully expect that. When I said after the election it's time to talk about tax again, it's time for us to formulate a new policy. I think members have embraced that wholeheartedly. So there'll be plenty of debate around that, and that's a really healthy thing. But our policy won't be formulated by the conference. It never is. It gets, the remits that get passed by conference get fed into the policy process from there.
Look, obviously capital gains tax comes up repeatedly, and although some people too have talked about a wealth tax. Is it your view, though, that you want to get that policy work done and dusted next year so that you have a kind of full year running into the election where you can explain your policy to the public?
I think if you're going to campaign on a different tax system, then you do need to do that work before you can announce anything. You do need to do that well in advance of an election so that you can work all of the issues through. You can, can identify any weaknesses and what you might have come up with. You can consult with the experts and so on. So I do think we need to make sure that we do that next year, so that when election rolls around, everyone knows what to expect from a Labor government.
But that will also include, because I think you've talked about this before, a different fiscal approach in terms of whether you look at debt to GDP ratios, those sorts of things, and whether you changed what has been previous Labor policy on that?
Well, I think Ganesh Nana last week made it the really good point that we cannot just think about government debt alone without thinking about the nation's debt. If all government's doing is transferring debt from government to individual households and the country's overall debt is growing, are we really better off? Actually, most households would probably think that they're worse off because they're more in debt than they were before. So I think we have to think about how we reduce the nation's debt, how do we increase the nation's income. Those are things that we should be focused on as a country, not just the part of it that relates directly to government.
And all that comes down to productivity. So is there work going on what sort of initiatives can be used to lift productivity?
It comes down to productivity, but also the nature of our economy. So at the moment, we still have a lot of our eggs in a small number of baskets. If we want to, have greater economic growth, which was driven by productivity, we do need to diversify New Zealand's economy. This is not new. We've been talking about this for the last 30 or 40 years, but we've got to really bring a sense of urgency to that, because the world is changing so fast now that if we don't pick up the pace, we'll just get left behind.
And are those issues up for debate at the conference?
Absolutely. So, AI is driving a huge amount of change. It's going to drive a huge amount of displacement for working people. We've got to have answers to that. We've got to have retraining opportunities available for those people who need to retrain. We've actually got to focus on supporting those businesses who are in that new part of the economy, with real growth potential. We've got to look at diversifying our exports. I think our primary sector does an amazing job and actually is incredibly productive relative to other primary sectors around the world. But if we want more productivity as a country, we're going to need to be productive in other areas than just primary produce.
Investing in infrastructure is also seen as crucial to lifting productivity. And I know that Labor seems to be taking a much more bipartisan approach with the government over that. How do you see that in terms of trying to forge some agreement with the government over that general approach to infrastructure investment?
Well, I think what this government did in the first few months in office was absolutely reckless, which is basically put everything on hold just because it wasn't them that started it. We didn't do that in 2017. So if you look at some of the big infrastructure projects that started during their previous tenure in government, things like Transmission Gully, we continued those on and we made sure that they were finished. Some of the school projects that I inherited as Minister of Education, we made sure we finished them. And actually, we did a lot more.
But you did cancel some roads of national significance that they had in train, although work hadn't started.
Exactly, the work hadn't started. Yeah. They came in and they put pause on a whole lot of stuff that was already underway. And I think that was just reckless. So I've said that we won't do that. But what we do need to do as a country is get our planning, our consenting, our design processes much, much further into the future, preparing much further into the future, so that when governments change, if government priorities change, it doesn't grind everything to a halt. If you've got a menu of options in terms of the infrastructure projects that you might want to fund, it doesn't matter if government priorities change because you're still keeping that pipeline full. What's happened in the last year is the building and construction sector has experienced this massive downturn, in part driven by the fact that the current government came in and said, we don't want to do that stuff the previous government were going to do, but they weren't ready to implement the stuff that they wanted to do, and so everyone else is just left sitting around twiddling their thumbs. 12,000 jobs have gone from the building and construction sector since the election. That's remarkable in just a one-year period. That could have been avoided.
Over the ditch, the Australian Labor government issued the first new mandate for the 230 billion Australian dollar Future Fund in 15 years, directing the fund to invest in residential housing, the energy transition to net zero and local infrastructure. Our senior reporter and correspondent in Sydney, Lachlan Cahoon, and co-editor Hamish McNichol with this.
Whenever governments have access to a significant amount of money, it's a sure thing that it will get political. In the case of Australia's sovereign wealth fund, the Future Fund, the surprise is that it has taken so long. Lachlan, why don't you bring us up to date on the Future Fund first? What exactly is it?
So, Hamish, it was founded in 2006 by the Howard government, the former coalition government. It was initially to cover the government's superannuation obligations to public servants. They actually get a much better deal than most other people. Their guarantee is 15.4% of their income, whereas the rest of us is only 11.5%. So the obligations of the government are a bit steeper on the public servant superannuation. So it was seeded initially with the government sale of Telstra when they privatised it. They tipped in $14 billion from that, topped it up with a budget surplus that year. So they started with $60 billion in 2006. It's now worth $230 billion. And that's just the investment income. They haven't tipped any other funds into it. So there have been no drawdowns so far. And the year seems to have swung simply from a narrow focus on superannuation for public servants to general funding of government finances, but the fund hasn't been required so far, and they won't do any redemptions until at least 2032, by which time it's estimated the fund will be up to $380 billion. Just put that in perspective. I mean, the oil fund in Norway, that was founded in 1990. It's now worth the US 1.74 trillion. So that's 325,000 US dollars for every Norwegian citizen. And there's only 5.5 million of those. At the moment, our fund, $230 billion. There are 26 million of us. That's about $9,000 for every Australian.
So what sort of things has the Future Fund invested in so far? What have the results been like?
Well, it hasn't been too bad. They returned 9.1% last year. Over the last 10 years, the return has been 8.3%. They go for a CPI plus 4 or 5%, and they've managed to achieve that. It's a fairly standard asset allocation. For example, the biggest allocation is 21% to developed market equities, then 14% to alternatives, private equity 13%, and then 11% to credit fixed income. So they say they've so far invested about 12 billion in Australian infrastructure. There's a company called Tilt Renewables. They've invested in that, airport infrastructure in Melbourne and Perth, and investment in data centres.
Have there been any other controversies with the fund?
Not really, no. It's been flying under the radar politically, which is surprising to me given how much money there is and how politicians act around pots of money. In 2011, there was a bit of a fuss about, it came to light that they'd invested in 15 companies involved in the production of nuclear weapons. And then in 2013, they were under pressure and excluded tobacco companies, so they screened them out. So there's been criticism in recent years that their ESG focus hasn't been market leading, and that as a government fund, they should be setting an example. But there have been reasons for that. I think Peter Costello, who was the original treasurer when they set up the fund, became the chairman of the Future Fund. And as a former Liberal treasurer, I think they were focused much more on pure returns than woke concepts such as ESG. So it's been pretty bread and butter approach to asset allocation and policy in that time.
So this new government mandate then, what is it? What's the response been like so far?
It's really the first time that the Labor government have had any kind of real influence on it. And Costello, his term as chairman as of the Future Fund finished last year, and the government appointed a long-time union representative, Greg Combay, as chair. So there's been a bit of a political switch in the composition of the fund. So the new wording is in the mandate to consider Australia's national priorities in investment decisions where possible, appropriate and consistent with strong returns. So that is increasing the supply of residential housing, supporting the energy transition as part of the net zero transformation, and delivering improved infrastructure located in Australia. So, of course, this is playing into the culture wars, and the opposition says the fund is being raided, the nest egg will disappear. But, you know, the coalition wants individual people to be able to raid their super for housing deposits. So, you know, it doesn't really wash there. And so I had a chat with a friend who's a bit of a Future Fund insider, and he said it was largely all window dressing. So it's going to be interesting to see what sort of impact it has. But it's certainly played into the culture war here, and the coalition say that if they win government next year, they'll rescind this decision and get it back to bread and butter. But it would be very interesting to see a more of a nation-building role for the fund. But that's going to happen very slowly, given how long it takes a ship to turn around like that.
And finally this Sunday, walking out on your job mid-contract just got easier. Join us as employment law expert Carl Blake looks at a recent case law to guide employers when their employee walks out.
Employment lawyers commonly advise employers who wrongly assume that if an employee just walks out and resigns without giving proper amount of notice under their employment agreement, the employer can withhold the equivalent of their salary for the unworked period of notice or make demand for it. The case we're about to discuss clarifies that this is not always possible. Carl, can you start with a bit of background on the case, please?
Sure. So just taking a step back, notice provisions are mutual. Obviously, if you are an employer, you need to give notice in your employment agreement. And similarly, if an employer wants to terminate employment for any reason, it has to be cause, of course, but it needs to also do the same and give the correct contractual amount of notice. So the situation sometimes arises where the employer, as you said earlier, just walks out. For whatever reason, it could be justified in the sense of a constructive dismissal, or just because they don't want to continue to work out their notice period. And effectively, there's two avenues that the employer can take. One, which I've never seen done, is to raise a breach of contract claim against the employee to say, well, you have breached your employment agreement. the difficulty with that is that the employer needs to prove loss. And we'll get to that in a minute about the inconvenience and the difficulties that an employee can put an employer in if they don't give the right notice. But it's so inherently difficult to prove loss, and it's so expensive to raise a claim against an employee that typically that avenue is never pursued, even though it is actually open to an employer. So the way that employers have typically sought to seek some form of redress is to include mutually agreed in the employment agreement to say that if you don't give us the right amount of notice, we can withhold, if not paid, or claw back, we're paid, the period of notice you didn't give us. And that's common in the sense that it's not often that employees just walk out, but it's relatively common for employers to think, well, actually, I've got that clause, I'm going to exercise it, which is exactly what this case of Kayleys and Taina Dedman covered from the Employment Court last month. So the background is exactly as I described effectively. The employee, for health reasons, gave 1 day's notice of resignation and left the next day. As it happened, the way the pay periods overlapped, they had been paid $1,300 already in the pay cycle, and the employer sought to get that back and also withhold, in the sense of, requiring to be repaid $3,000, effectively about $4,400 in total. So some had been paid, they wanted to get that back, and they actually said, no, you need to pay us the $3,000 as well. And it looked closely at the concept of, well, is this a penalty, is it a penalty clause, or is it actually a genuine compensation, if you like, for the employer to be compensated for the loss they've suffered as a result of an employee not giving the right amount of notice? And the court, they were quite pragmatic here. They said, look, we realise that in some circumstances there will be a loss to the business. In this case, the Kayleys had to cover the employee in their absence. They say they lost sales as a result, and everyone had to sort of buckle down and cope without the employee, and there was no handover. And the court said, look, we recognise there can be a loss to an employer in these situations. As I said, maybe it's you need to recruit someone else urgently, or maybe you need to get some cover, getting a temp in to cover or something like that, which wasn't the case here because that would have actually been an actual loss. But then the court said, well, actually, we think that that loss that this business suffered was completely out of step, and it was disproportionate to the loss they suffered. So to ask the employee to forfeit the $1,300 already paid and repay the $3,000 was just excessive. They called it exorbitant, and that it was a penalty, and it wasn't intended to compensate them. Rather, it was intended to punish the employee for not giving the right amount of notice. So where does that leave us? Super helpfully, the court actually said, here's a clause, well, broad wording of a clause that would work in the future. So this is something that we're encouraging our clients to think about when looking at these clauses. Certainly, if they have an existing clause that doesn't meet the wording I'll just shortly get to, they need to at least contemplate that. And effectively, the wording is that the court has suggested is that, look, you can have a clause that says you will forfeit the amount of the notice you don't give us, and very importantly, all the cost or damage incurred by us, whatever is the lesser. So that means if the business can't show any form of loss whatsoever, and it's easy to replace the employee and there was no real damage apart from inconvenience, then the lesser of those two would be nothing, which means you can't reclaim any money. But if you had to get a temp in, or you could demonstrate a clear link between an employee's absence from the workplace and lost sales as a result, or something like that, or a miscontract, or something that cost the company money, that test would work to say, well, actually, we can look to claim back or demand the loss we've suffered. But can't be more than the notice period. So it's nice that the court hasn't just simply said, well, we appreciate this happens all the time, but it was a breach. It's actually said, well, you might want to think about this going forward to help compliance in the future.
So what would you say are the key issues of this case?
I think the key issues would be ensuring that if you did want to use a clawback or some sort of way of ensuring that you were compensated or not out of pocket as a result of an employee's failure to give notice. And bearing in mind, I should have said at the outset, notice isn't something, a resignation isn't something you can accept or not. People say, well, I accept your resignation. Well, that's more of a polite way of saying, well, you have no choice. It's not something that you can accept. It is a unilateral act that the employee has the power to make. An employer can't unilaterally, without cause, dismiss. Obviously, serious misconduct, you've got the right to do that after a process, but the employer has the prerogative to say, I'm resigning, and that's their decision. So in this case, if you did want to look at clawing back some money as a result of their breach of contract, failure to give the right notice, have a look at what's fair and reasonable. What have you actually suffered as a result? Have you lost anything, or is it just annoying or inconvenient? And if you have the right clause, which says the lesser of the actual loss you've suffered or the notice period itself payment, then you might be able to certainly go in and do that. Obviously, good faith would apply to the whole arrangement. You'd need to consult, work with the employee, not just send them letters to say this is happening. But when the right circumstances, with the right wording, you can be in a better position than certainly trying to sue for breach of contract.
So what did the employment court find in the end?
They said that in this case, the proportionality test meant that the loss suffered by the employer, i.e. not really financial, was outweighed in the sense that this was more of a punishment to the employee to hold them to giving the right amount of notice. So it ordered that it was unlawful to seek the $3,000, and they said separately if the employer claims for the $1,300 that was withheld, basically they're saying they would win. But they didn't make that order because the order wasn't sought. It's a bit of a technicality. They can't make orders if they're not claimed. But basically they said to the employee, you're also entitled to that $1,300 they withheld from you.
Mm-hmm. So to spell it all out, what should employers be taking out of this?
I think they should be looking at their contracts. They may not all employment agreements have these deductions clauses, but if they were to look at that sort of framework, I'd get the wording from the case and put that into your contracts.
And thanks again for joining us. Our news team is back from 5 a.m. tomorrow with the latest business news and analysis you can use on mbr.co.nz, and join Mike McRoberts from 5:30 p.m. tomorrow for a look at the day's top stories. Mā te wā. See you next week.